He sold his poems to buy his freedom. I'm Marjorie Hudson, founder and director of the George Moses Horton Project, which seeks to promote creativity, inspire young people, and educate individuals about this extraordinary man, the first Black man to publish a book in the South, George Moses Horton. By the end of my talk, I hope you will join me in spreading the word about this extraordinary person. He was a hero of the abolition movement. He was a poet of renown, author of 3 books, an icon of literacy and freedom, and a self-proclaimed and widely recognized genius. All this while living in slavery. How did I learn about George Moses Horton? It was an extraordinary moment in my life, and it changed my life. This all started in 1993. I was a guest speaker in my stepdaughter's 8th grade history class at Horton Middle School. I was new to Chatham County, and I was a new stepmother, and I was writing about history for the North Carolina Literary Review, especially about Indigenous history and the explorer John Lawson. My stepdaughter was so impressed that she convinced her teacher that I should come to her class and lecture. And as I was preparing, I looked in the journal and I was flipping through and I saw a small piece about George Moses Horton. I had never heard of him. I thought I'd bring him up too because he was so inspiring. He lived there in Chatham County where these students were from, and he was the first Black man to publish a book in the South. And at that point, something very interesting happened. Mr. Arthurs, the teacher, turned to one side and kind of whispered in my ear, the school is named for him. And it wasn't like, you dummy. It was a secret. And all this time I'd been dropping my girl at soccer, going to PTA, driving past the big sign, Horton Middle School, and I'd never thought to ask, Horton who? I didn't quite believe Mr. Arthurs. Why didn't the sign out front say George Moses Horton Middle School? So I took an informal poll of my friends and neighbors. That's when I discovered that in Chatham County, North Carolina, as in so many places, what Black people know about history and what white people know about history are 2 different things. I asked my friend, Miss Ruth. She was a Black elder in my church who I knew loved to read poetry. I asked her if she'd ever heard of George Moses Horton. She looked me in the eye and she said, well, Margie, I believe I'm related to him. Of course, Miss Ruth's last name was Horton, and her daughter, Margie Horton Ellison, another member of my church, was a descendant through her father. So you can see I was on a kind of a fool's journey out of ignorance into knowledge. I asked another Chatham native, a white county commissioner who was a dear friend and grown up. Her father was a judge. Her family had been friends with President Roosevelt. She had a picture of Eleanor's little dog in her upstairs room. She said to me, oh no, the school was named for Judge Horton, a white man. So then I looked up the school in the county history book. I learned that Horton Middle had been Pittsboro Colored School in the early 20th century. Then it became Horton High, educating many African Americans who had become leaders in my generation, in my community, including Margaret Pollard, who was soon to be voted in as a county commissioner. And then I learned that by 1970, when the school was integrated, I just guessed that someone must have told the story, trying to cover up the past for people who didn't know any better, or for people who didn't really want to know any better. Um, that it was named for the judge, and you know, and somehow that might be more comforting to white parents and students. Um, so that's what we run into with Black history. It's history that makes us, as white people, sometimes makes us a little uncomfortable, and so it gets pressed down. Um, I learned also that the original Horton School had an active alumni association, and Margie Horton Ellison was a leader. They all knew who the school was named for. And in a strange twist, I would also learn that Mr. Arthurs, my stepdaughter's history teacher, the white man who told me that secret, was a Horton on his mother's side, descended from the family whose ancestors had enslaved George. So let you sit with that for a minute. We have a complicated world, a world that's kind of looking away from the past. We're so busy in our present world. But to me, this was fascinating. The thing about history in the South, I'm not from here, but history is stories. History is personal. And that draws me in every time. So Horton was well known outside the county by scholars in North Carolina. They had written several books, but not by the people who lived here right now, right down the road from where George grew up and wrote his poetry, much of it about Chatham County. So that bothered me. And I started to think about what I could do to make sure that his name would never again be forgotten by local people and would be respected and honored for the gifts that he gave to this place and our history. So let's talk about George. Little George was 3 years old when he first set foot in Chatham County in 1800, already a slave. And he lived on a farm between Haw River and New Hope Creek. He lived with his mother, 3 sisters and brother, and his master, William Horton, and family. As a young child, he loved to sing lively tunes, and he loved to hear people read out loud. He decided he was going to learn to read too. Now, there were no schools for him and his family. You know, this was way out in the country, and there would be no schools for him anyway. But presumably, William Horton's family tried to teach their children, and somehow he got hold of bits and pieces of school books that they perhaps had used. We know all this because he wrote an autobiography. And in his autobiography, he described it this way. So let me share screen. And I will read a little bit from his autobiography. On well nigh every Sabbath during the year, did I retire away in the summer season to some shady and lonely recess, where I could stammer over the dim syllables in my old black and tattered spelling book, sometimes a piece of one, then of another, nor would I scarcely spare the time to return to my ordinary meals, being so truly engaged with my book. Well, you might notice that his language is different from ordinary language. It's quite elevated. And you will see why and how he began to speak and write over the course of his years. You can also see what an extraordinary thing it is to hear in his own words about the personal life of an enslaved man who was fascinated with reading. He couldn't stop reading. You might know some children who sneak off with books every chance they get. And he was just like that. So another thing, George got hold of a book of hymns and loved the rhymes and rhythms. Maybe more about that. We can talk about that later, but I tracked down the church where the Horton family must have built and attended in some of my research. While he tended cows during the week, he began to make up his own rhymes and memorize them to recite later. So he was very bored tending cows, and he complains about it bitterly in his autobiography. So he could read a little bit now. He could kind of spell things out a little, but he had not yet had anybody to teach him how to write things down. In 1814, when young George was 17, he suffered a terrible trauma. His master, William Horton, had decided it was time to divide his estate. His sons and heirs drew lots, and George's family was split up between several heirs, along with the furniture and livestock and land. This is, of course, we all know one of the cruelest aspects of slavery is that families were separated. And he felt this deeply. He wrote a poem about it. And I'm going to ask a volunteer to read from Division of an Estate. And please go ahead. First volunteer.
This is Maria LaFlores wrote. I'm going to read this. Hi. But oh, the state, the dark suspense in which poor vassals stand, each mind upon the spire of chance hangs. Fluctuant. The day of separation is at hand. Imagination lifts her gloomy curtain, like evening's mantle at the flight of day, through which the trembling pinnacle we spy, on which we soon must stand with hopeful smiles, or apprehending frowns to tumble on the night or left forever.
Thank you. So the trembling pinnacle we spy is the platform on which perhaps they stood. And of course, this is elevated language. It's a lament, but you can feel the kind of terrifying suspense that a family might know. And because, of course, they lived in a very expansive geography or large parcels of land, they wouldn't see each other, at least not for long, long periods of time. And their lives would change dramatically. And that's exactly, of course, what happened to George. So George Moses Horton was not down for long. And this is a pattern in his life. It's quite extraordinary. It's one of the things I love to talk about with students. He got up once he figured out where he was living and what family he still had. He started to walk the 9 miles to the university town of Chapel Hill and sell fruits and vegetables to the young students at the farmer's market. Now, I think this was part of his job. So I don't think he was making any money from this, but he had a little bit of freedom. He had a scooch of freedom in that separation from being on the farm and where he was living. And he entertained the college boys by performing his rhymes. And they thought it was extraordinary. They were enthralled. And of course, at the time, University of North Carolina campus had only young men. There were no women there. But that they were all kind of, amazed and talking and joking and kind of loving it. But then some of them, and I think if you read about this, UNC students, even in that day, were kind of known for their shenanigans with drink. They pressed some drink upon him, and they planned to get him so drunk that he would spout poetry. And George was eager to do this at first, but eventually decided it was beneath his dignity. And he also writes about how his brother was actually smarter and more talented than he was, but he succumbed to the drink. So he had very serious reasons to stop drinking. And here's a small bit of the poem he made up about that struggle. It's called The Tip to His Bottle. And I invite our next volunteer to read.
Yeah. Okay, Nancy, go ahead.
What hast thou ever done for me? Defeated every good endeavor. I never can through life agree to place my confidence in thee. Not ever, no, never.
Thank you. So these poem excerpts that you're reading are short. His poems are usually about 3 to 8 stanzas long, but this really gets to the heart of his, his struggle with the drink. And it gives insight. These poems give insight into the life of a man, excuse me, who's expressing his life through poetry around the same time that Emily Dickinson was expressing her life through poetry. So his struggles are different. He has a different mind at work at the same time as he's insightful and playing with very elevated language. So back to UNC students. Here's the part of the story you may have heard. I hope so. The students began to pay George to compose love poems for their sweethearts. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to make up poems out of the blue sky. So they would give him their name and he would write a poem about them during the week in his head, well, tending his livestock. And his first poem, his first customer was Augustus Alston, the Alstons of Chatham, I believe. And he paid 25 cents for a poem, which was a lot of money in those days. And truthfully, it's a lot of money these days for poets now. Poets don't make a lot of money, but poetry was really revered and his talent was revered. And of course, the students believed that his talent would help win their sweethearts. So by the 1820s, Horton had a thriving business selling love poems while he was at the farmer's market. He would invent verses in his head, and then he would memorize them and dictate them to the college boy to write down in his own hand, because he still could not write. And also the boy was interested in, it being his handwriting in the love poem. George's weekly income rose from poetry to as much as $4 or $5 a week. And that was pretty good money for anybody at that time. He began to dream of freedom. His student friends brought him classics to read, Virgil and Homer and Shakespeare. And you begin to see how this elevated language rose in him and became a language that he claimed. And he began to invent poems on wider subjects, mythology, love and truth, and his poetic muse. So our next poem is called On the Poetic Muse. And I am going to scroll up, and I hope that I'm going to have to scroll up while you read. Please, our next volunteer.
Far, far of this world I soar, and almost nature, lose, aerial regions to explore with this ambitious muse. My towering thoughts with pinions rise under the gales of song, which waft me through the middle skies with music on my tongue.
So it's beautiful. I mean, he's just full of joy in his poetry. And he's, beginning to use description of where he lives and its beauty and, the sky, the birds and so on. And explain his thoughts about his creativity. So Horton's most well-known poems are about big ideas, freedom, poetry, slavery, history, but his personal life comes alive in them too. His sense of humor, adventure, and everyday life. And our next poem is about a haunted house. And it shows his sense of humor and his the breadth of his thinking and enjoyment in poetry. This is called The Fearful Traveler in the Haunted Castle. And our next reader, again, thank you to our next volunteer. I will scroll up so you can read the ending.
Some unknown finger thumps the door from one of faltering voice, till someone seems to walk the floor with an alarming noise. 'Twas but the noise of prowling rats, which ran with all their speed, pursued in haste by hungry cats, which on the vermin feed. Thus man is often his own self, who makes the night his ghost, and shrinks with horror from himself, which is to fear the most.
So, it starts out funny, right? And scary, like here's a horror story. But this was during the time when he's really kind of seeing a larger world, seeing what young white men about his age are capable of, and perhaps the people around him are capable of, or perhaps his own self. And his insights about human nature are deep, becoming deep on the page. So he also wrote about hunting in the woods of Chatham County. So here's a short section of a poem called The Woodman and the Money Hunter. And so our next volunteer, please.
Woodman and the Money Hunter. Speaks up. The Woodman and the Money Hunter. Throughout our rambles, much we find. Bee trees burst with honey. Wild birds we tame of every kind. At once they seem to be resigned. I know but one that lags behind. There's nothing lags but money.
So you get the idea that amongst this kind of rambling through the woods and descriptive poetry about where he lives, which is instructive. This is what people did in those days. He's aware, and this is a repeated refrain, nothing lags but money. He's aware that he needs money, and he's thinking about it a lot. It's on his mind, or his goal of freedom. And perhaps he was already saving when he wrote this. So the next poem is a little fun too. We know Horton is a very serious poet, but I like having insight into the warmth of his daily life expressed in poems. So this next one is called Trouble with the Itch and Rubbing with Sulfur. So our next reader, please.
Tis bitter, yet 'tis sweet, scratching effects from transient ease. Pleasure and pain together meet and vanish as they please. In fine, I know this, I'm sorry. In fine, I know not which can play the most deceitful game. The devil, sulfur, or the itch. The three are but the same.
So, everybody in the room has had an itch and, had these feelings. And I love that he's really inviting us in to his personal life, and we can all connect. So my favorite poem in this vein is about a nagging wife, and it uses the metaphor of snap beans for a snappish mouth. Next reader, please, for snaps for dinner, snaps for breakfast, and snaps for supper.
To dinner squalls the dame, you need it now perhaps, but hear the husband's loud exclaim, I do not like your snaps. 'Tis snaps when at your breakfast meal, and snaps when at your spinning wheel. Too many by a devilish deal, for all your words are snaps.
So we can identify with that as well. So George Moses Horton did marry, and this poem, I believe, was written later after freedom. And he did have two children, one named Rhodey and one named Free. All right, so at UNC, George met someone who changed his life, a mentor, a faculty wife, and novelist. And let me put in a plug for mentors. Those of you who volunteer, it's so valuable. And a mentor is someone who changes a young person's life by just showing up and just being there. Anybody can do it. So his new mentor, Caroline Lee Hentz, taught him to write. Now he could write down his poems. She began to encourage his hopes for freedom by helping him publish a book. And the name of the book was The Hope of Liberty. It was published in 1829, and it remains the first book published by a Black man in the South, and certainly the first of two. And certainly there are no other books that we know of at that time being published by enslaved people. So he had a great privilege not accorded to many other enslaved people in having this mentor. And so the idea of making money for his freedom was that he would sell books by subscription. So that was common at that time, and save the proceeds. So he was starting to get famous, and he was getting recognition. And three benefactors, including Governor John Owen, attempted to purchase George's freedom from James Horton for $100 over the purchase price. James refused. In 1831, his mentor left the Chapel Hill area, and George sorely missed her friendship and support. But again, he did not give up. He published poems in the Raleigh Register, Freedom's Journal, and the Liberator. After reading George's moving poems about yearning to be free, Northern abolitionists began to advocate for his freedom as well. And he became really quite well known in abolitionist movement. So his next poem is one of his poems on a more serious subject. It's called Slavery. Our next reader, please.
Is it because my skin is black that thou shouldst be so dull and slack, and scorn to set me free? Then let me hasten to the grave, the only refuge for the slave who mourns for liberty.
So you can see this was published in the Liberator. So that was one of the abolitionist journals of the time. And his poems on freedom and yearning and being enslaved are very moving to me, and they're the ones most often read, and that's a good thing. I just like to sneak in those personal stories that he writes about everyday life. So I think one of the reasons his master at the time refused the sale, I can't read his mind, but one of them was that he was making money from George. But George hired out his weekly hours by giving him 25 cents a week, which he had received from the poems he was writing. So Horton was valuable to James, and Horton benefited from this arrangement by living on campus and studying with students. He did odd jobs for UNC President Joseph Caldwell, and lived in his home, and visited college lectures. And the story is told that he also lectured the students himself. Around this time, however, the North Carolina legislature passed laws prohibiting enslaved people from hiring out their own time. It also became illegal for them to read or write. Horton lived in violation of these laws, perhaps protected by being on the UNC campus most of the time. Another change in his life: in 1843, Hall Horton became George's third master and raised the weekly hire to $50. But again, George did not give up. In 1845, he published his second book of poems, The Poetical Works of George Moses Horton, and his master set the cost of freedom at $250. The book sales did not raise enough. He asked the new UNC president to contribute. He asked the famous Northern abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison to help, but answers did not come. And you can imagine he must have been deeply discouraged. And as privileged as his life might seem to be at this time, his yearning for freedom dominated his life. It would take a civil war for America to free its enslaved people, including George Moses Horton. On May 20, 1861, North Carolina became one of the last states to secede from the Union, and UNC students volunteered for the Confederate Army. Ironically, many of these young men were Horton's loyal customers and friends. He lost a steady income when they left. So George Moses Horton finally walked away to freedom in 1865 when Union troops came to Chapel Hill. He was 68 years old. He lived among the troops, and he was championed by, perhaps writing love poems for them as well, championed by Captain William Banks of the 9th Michigan Cavalry Volunteers, who arranged to publish his third book, modestly titled Naked Genius. And it is really a wonderful, wonderful book. It's one of my favorites, and it is still in print, available from the Chapel Hill Historical Society in facsimile. So here's a picture of the book, which you can get from them if you choose. Captain Banks promoted the book as a way for disabled Union vets to make their fortunes and prove the worthiness of their fight in the war against slavery. And this book contains poems about Lincoln, poems about North and South, poems about soldiering, poems about battles, plus a lot of the personal poems that you heard. Captain Banks went home to Michigan, and George Moses Horton went north to Philadelphia and freedom. Let me just check and see what the next is. This is the inside back cover that was sort of the broadside. Energetic young men, especially those who become disabled and make their fortunes, from the pen of a North Carolina Negro, the Black poet will be read with admiration and wonder by all. So isn't that just lovely language? Again, Captain Banks and others were in wonderment at the mind of this extraordinary person. And Banks and the soldiers stood up for freedom and equal rights for all. So I think this refutes, at least in this one circumstance, the idea that we hear sometimes that Union troops weren't all that excited about the cause of freeing enslaved people. I think it was very, very clear that this was a important moment in Captain Banks's life. So a few things. What's going on now? What's happened since George Moses Horton was freed? What's happened since I began to become interested and obsessed, really, with this man? So around just before I learned about George Moses Horton, he was inducted into the Literary Hall of Fame in Southern Pines, and this brochure was created. So that's a huge honor. It was in 1966. And then in Chatham County, I decided, you know what? I'm going to get some honor for this fellow. So I went to my county commissioner with my friend Ruth Horton, who was related to Horton, and made a proclamation and created George as the historic poet laureate of Chatham County. Not to preclude a living poet laureate. So another moment. I applied for a historic marker. I did some research. They required me to track down the location of one of the places he lived. I was able to do that through the help of several scholars and my topographical maps. And it turns out he lived not that far from the farm where I lived. The marker was approved in 1999. The language was approved by well-known scholar, Dr. Trudier Harris at UNC. And it was the first for an African American in Chatham County. And I think Sharwin and I have talked about passing it on 15501 at Mount Gilead Church Road. So then in 2000, I partnered with the Horton Middle School and the Chatham County Arts Council to create the George Moses Horton Project, and 15 arts and humanities programs in schools and community. I was deeply obsessed, including a Black Oral History Project, a poetry contest, George Moses Horton Chorale for the school chorus, poetry quilt, and a George Moses Horton Freedom Path, each stepping stone based on a drawing by a Horton Middle School student. I was still called Horton Middle School, which was based on images they'd heard read aloud to them of Horton's poem on summer. And this is one of the stepping stones before it's grouted. So another honor that came to Horton UNC campus dedicated part of a residence hall to him in 2007. And I was fortunate to attend that ceremony with some of his family members. And then in 2016, Black author Don Tate wrote and illustrated a children's book, Poet, The Remarkable Story of George Moses Horton. It's a great gift. I've been waiting for someone to write this. It's a great gift for families with young children, available at a bookstore near you. He came and spoke to the children at Horton Middle School, and his book has become the gift, the graduation gift that every student receives. So more, this is the Horton Freedom Path. And one of the principals, Mrs. Valencia Toomer, she's moved on, but this was several years ago, and you can see this beautiful Freedom Path with student mosaics has grown somewhat derelict. There's been a drainage issue. So one of my projects now is to restore the area. And the current principal, Principal Robinson, is very excited about that. And another thing that happened just a few years ago is that the school board approved giving the school the full name, George Moses Horton Middle School. And here are some of the people who, I was always going around giving these talks, and then some folks in the NAACP. Del Turner was a school board member. Mary Nettles is a leader in our local NAACP. Even Harris is a pastor, is very active with NAACP. This is me in all my glory. We're all kind of holding our masks. And this is Ephraim Ramirez on the right, who's been wanting the school to change its name for a long time. So, oof. So let me just show you one of the things that happened with the mosaic is that we never had the money or time to create a permanent sign. So now we're in the process of creating a sign, excuse me, there you go, of the George Moses Horton Freedom Path. And this is going to be a banner, and then there will be a permanent sign, and each of them has a QR code that links to the website at the school, and contains all this information, a timeline, information about the Freedom Path, and lots of educational materials and fun activities that students and teachers can do at the Freedom Path. So I'm very hopeful about the future. I hope to go to the school. They have a George Moses Horton Day now. I'll be there Monday, February 27, talking about the path and talking about Horton and answering questions. Just one thing I like to do at the end of our conversation, let me just see, is to read to you a song, is to read together a few lines from, excuse me, this is flipping around here. Give me a sec. Of Song of Liberty and Parental Advice by George Moses Horton. And I imagine that he wrote this for his children when he left for Philadelphia, or perhaps when he was yearning for freedom and Union soldiers were coming. And I'd like us all to unmute. It's going to be a mess, but actually you're not on Zoom, so you can just speak as loud as you like and read this with me. It's just a lovely, lovely poem that I hope you'll take home in your hearts. Let us begin, everyone together. Come help me sing the morning song. Woods are sweetly blooming, and bear the joyful strain along, that happier days are coming. So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Marjorie, is George Moses Horton buried in Chatham County, or?
That's a great question. I actually worked with a filmmaker about 10 years ago who was going to the graves of famous poets all over the country and reading poems to their graves. And he was trying to find George Moses Horton's grave, and nobody has. So we had to find something else to do, but it may still happen. It's possible he was buried in Philadelphia. Some scholars say he might have been part of the movement by formerly enslaved people to Liberia. That was a popular move at the time. So we don't have the burial spot. If you went into records, you could find the locations of the farms of the white Hortons, but the Black family's graves are unknown to me.
Are there any existing portraits of him or pictures? Do we know what he looks like?
People have proposed, and people have found some photographs from that period and have mused that they might be of him. One is of a Black man in a Union soldier's jacket. One is of a Black man with a sort of a straw hat on. But scholars have shown that these pictures are not likely to have been George, and it's very sad. You know, we all want to see a picture of him. But what we have is his poems. That's the picture. Anything else? Yes.
I just finished reading the book called Horse.
I'm sorry, which book?
Horse. Horse. That's the name of the book.
Okay.
It's about.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Book. The young man, Black man, wants to learn to read. And he is told that it is against the law. Was this just a state law because that was Kentucky? Or is this a law that came into being after George Moses Horton lived?
Well, as I said, that law came into play in North Carolina around the 1830s and 40s. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date. It was widespread in the South, and it was in response to the Nat Turner uprising. Plantation owners, farm owners, white leaders became fearful of uprisings, and of course, a note passed from enslaved person to enslaved person could help organize that. There was an attempted uprising in Charleston, South Carolina, and that was the suspicion, was that enslaved people would fight for their freedom by rising up, and that the word would be a weapon. So it was a widespread crushing of the increasingly liberal rules for enslaved people to work as free laborers, you know, to have kind of free reign, to be special, to work in specialized arts and crafts and skills and hire out their time. So that the enslaved people had at least in this part of the country, had some privileges in some places, but that all got shut down. And somehow George Moses Horton, probably by living on the UNC campus, avoided punishment. You know, and he was a friend of governors. I mean, have you ever met somebody who just had such a powerful personality that the rules didn't apply? You know, I think that was true for him. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Marjorie?
Yes.
A couple of years outside of on the other side of the street from the middle school, there was a flagpole. And there were people that were loyal to the Confederacy flying a Confederate flag and whatnot. So there was, you know, quite a bit of uproar and whatnot. And that was at the point they were going to take down, I think, the statue that was in the center of the town.
Yeah.
Did you experience any kind of backlash or ill will or anything during that time because you were such a supporter, a loyal supporter of George Moses Horton?
I remember that time well. I remember that time well, and I remember the flag well. It's an enormous flag that all the children could see on their way to school in the morning. And I'm sure it frightened them. It frightened me. The flagpole was cut down in the middle of the night by someone, and the flag is gone. But when I saw that, I was not afraid for myself, but I was angry for the students. And that's when I decided to gear up. It'd been a while. I've been working on a couple of books and I decided to gear up and make them change, convince people to change the name of the school. And my dream is to have an annual parade and literary festival with giant puppets and music and song and poetry, just to counteract that energy that still lingers. But so we're doing some wonderful things on campus so that the identification with George Moses Horton, his name is on all the walls now. Don't ever be ashamed or scared that your school is named for an enslaved man who was a genius. The principal has put together 5 ways to honor Horton on campus. First of all, he's creating a media center that honors the history of the school as a school for colored children and a high school. And he's interacted with alumni of those schools in order to provide objects, sports jackets and stories and oral histories. That will be a permanent display in the media center, so children will never forget where this school's heritage was from. I think it's probably the only media center display in any school in North Carolina that acknowledges segregation. Secondly, we're restoring the Horton Freedom Path and creating those educational materials. Third, there's a new mural sponsored by the CRC committee of the NAACP that will be emblazoned with local Black leaders' faces. Fourth, there's a room that's been set aside by the principal and the school board for use and as a gathering place for the Black Horton alumni. And I just want to, an aside is that when we had the George Moses Horton Jubilee in 2000, had a huge all day long event and I invited alumni to come to the stage, including Margie Horton Ellison. And she said, none of us have been invited back to the school since it became integrated. Don't forget us. So now that welcome invitation, they're part of the school, they're honored in the school as well they should be. And the fifth thing is there's a mural of Don Tate's book, Poet, in the multi-purpose room. It takes up the whole wall behind the basketball hoop and kind of up high. And we hope to put some interactive poetry posters on the wall with readings out loud from children or local poets. And that's just kind of in the works. So what those flags did, they did what what happens in history, which is that when things go to extremes, the pendulum swings the other way because it's gone too far. So, yeah, that was tough. One other thing that's going on throughout the South is that the Jefferson Davis highway markers are being pulled up. I think it's Route 1 where the markers are, and there's talk of changing a portion of the name in Chatham County, of the name of the highway, to George Moses Horton Highway, because of course he walked to Chapel Hill, perhaps on that path. And I have seen wagon path, the kind of deep erosion that you see that signals an old traveling path in the days of horses and wagons. And it's kind of like Natchez Trace. I don't know if you know that, but it's just like a huge ditch where for starting with Native Americans, people traveled, and just the earth is beaten down over the years. So there was a road where 15501 is now, sort of, and so perhaps that's the path that Horton walked. So that would be appropriate. So just to wrap up, my goal is that you take this story home and talk about it, and find a way to lift up this story, either through being a mentor or just talking about how extraordinary he is, purchasing one of his books, speaking up when you see Black history being repressed, because it is about people who survived much and suffered much, and we all need to look at those lessons. Because they're an important part of our world and our country. So thank you. And you are all invited. My next book is coming out. And the launch is at the Farrington Barn. I think you heard, March 18 at 11 a.m. And it asks the question, what happens when a retired colonel in an upscale retirement village, a newcomer to the South, crosses paths with an elderly Black woman who keeps a list in the back of her Bible of all the crimes against her family by white men. And I'll just leave you with that for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.